You're listening to the Small and Supercharged podcast with Ria Freeman, episode 143. Welcome to another solo episode with me, yours truly. And today I'm going to ask a question about, are you a brand ambassador or are you an influencer? Or would you like to be a brand ambassador or would you like to be an influencer? Or are you not entirely sure what the difference is? And that's fine. That's what I'm here to chat about today, because I get asked this a lot. And I did a podcast for someone else a few weeks ago now. And that was one of the things that we talked about in quite a lot of detail, because it's quite important to realise the difference. So the thing is that influencers can also be brand ambassadors, and brand ambassadors can be influencers. So there is a crossover as well. But the real key difference comes in the loyalty towards specific brands. Now, I'll be honest and say that whether you're an influencer or a brand ambassador, I think that showing an authentic connection to brands is not a bad thing at all. When people jump around from brand to brand to brand to brand very, very quickly, I think that can erode their audience's trust in them, because they don't really know what they're talking about, as in they don't really understand whether they really do still like this product or are they just being paid to promote it. And I think it can create, as I said, distrust, or perhaps that's too extreme. Perhaps it's more a lack of engagement, a lack of thought about it. I know a few weeks ago on the podcast we had Verena, a girl about the yard, and she was saying it's almost a bit like, you know, when going back to school times and people kind of rock to each day and go, oh, this is the best thing ever. And the next day was, oh, this is the best thing ever. And you would just say, well, what do you really like? And I feel that can, even if you can move from brand to brand to brand because you're not connected or tied down in any way, with all of these, with being a brand ambassador and or an influencer, what I think is really important is making sure that your audience understand the journey that you're going on and that they don't feel taken advantage of, because we know that many brands will favour influencers with large followings, and as each person that makes up a following is a real person, unless it's a bot account, that's a whole different thing. We need to make sure that whatever we're doing, that our audience don't feel used and abused, you know, like they're a tool to get to a result. So I feel like if you're listening to this, whether you're an influencer, a brand ambassador, both, neither, thinking about it, whatever stage you're at, and I do also feel that this is going to be a really important thing moving forward as well. I feel that people don't want to feel like they're just a pawn in the game. And if they feel like their following allows people to do something that doesn't feel quite right and isn't really adding value, I think that people are likely to unfollow and move on. So whatever you pick, whatever you want to be, I think being authentic and genuine is really, really key. There we go. Strong start, right? But anyway, let's move on. So influencers, Jenna Kutcher says that an influencer is anybody who has got influence on social media. And that can be somebody with a following of one. And I completely subscribe to that. I know of brands who have worked with influencers with really huge followings and got less engagement, less conversion, less people know about their brand through them than people with smaller but much, much more engaged accounts. So I completely subscribe to that. And I think that if we all realise that we have the kind of position where we can influence people, and we should try and use that for good, you know, by being honest, by being genuine, by being authentic, and not just saying things because that's what we're being paid to say. That's a really good point to come from. I know that with my own account, and I'm not, you know, I'm an influencer in as much as I have an influence, like anyone listening here has an influence over their audience because they share things and people ask questions. And I do have that a lot, and I love, because when I put something on, it's because I really like it and I'm genuine about how I like it, how I got it, which is another really important thing, which we will touch on later as well. But I do take it as a real responsibility. If I've just got something I'm excited about, I won't say this is the best thing I've ever had in my whole life, but I will say that I'm excited about it and why I'm excited about it. I don't quite know what tangent that is, but still, it's good. So An influencer is anyone with influence, and that can be somebody with a really small following or a really big following. And sometimes smaller micro influencers, as they're called, can have more engagement. Well, generally they often have more engagement, and that can, from a brand point of view, even lead to a bigger conversion because they're seeing that content more. The influencer is responding more, is being more engaged with the audience, and that can have a better effect than a bigger influencer potentially. Potentially, not always the case, but it's really important from a brand point of view. If you're thinking about working with people, look at their following number, because that's a useful piece of information, but then look at their engagement, because that is a really, really useful piece of information. If they have got a massive account, but when you look at their pictures, no one really likes or comments, and when they do comment, the influencer doesn't bother to get back to them, that could be a lot less useful than having a smaller influencer, by which I mean somebody with a smaller account in size, but someone who's very engaged, who comments, who does the work, and who gets the comments and gets the likes as well. So that's just a bit of clarity there. But the thing with an influencer versus a brand ambassador is that if an influencer is working just as an influencer, so they don't have any brand ambassadorships at all, it usually means they are a completely free agent, as in they are not connected to any brand and don't really have any specific brand loyalty. Or at least they don't have to have any specific brand loyalty. I do think it is quite important to, depending on what you do, I think it is important to not jump from brand to brand to brand to brand to brand and declare everything as the best thing ever in very, very quick succession, because that's just not a normal kind of habit, I don't think, especially if you're being given things. If you buy things and you say, I bought this because I loved it, isn't it great? Amazing. But if you get given a load of things and each one you're coming on saying, I got this for free, it's also the best thing ever, and the next day you get the same thing, I think it can, as I was saying at the top of the episode, it can kind of erode what people think. People think you're being genuine or not. So although influencers who don't have any brand ambassadorships can really do whatever they like, it might be worth just thinking about who you would really want to work with and how that conflicts or complements the rest of your content. Again, this isn't me telling you what to do and what not to do. It's sharing my experience in the area, sharing how I work with brands when we're looking at whether to work with an influencer, who to work with, and also when we're looking at people as potential brand ambassadors. There's a lot of stuff that goes into it. I know one of the biggest turn-offs that I see from a brand point of view is when they're looking and they're kind of going, well, I don't really want to work with this person, even if it's they're planning to pay them, because last week they were saying this was the best thing, and that's a conflict for what I've got. But also the slightly taxing thing is the week before they were saying something else was also the best, and it's very, very similar. So although they can do what they like and they can work with whoever they like, it's worth keeping that in mind. It's just worth a little note to just consider that. Moving over to a brand ambassador. Now, these are influencers as well, because if you are working with a brand, the brand will want to work with you because of the ability and the ability you have to connect with your audience and to share new ideas, new things with them, which could be really, really valuable. But the usual difference here is that if you are a brand ambassador for a brand, you will usually have, or you should really have, some loyalty towards that brand in terms of product type. So that means if you're working with a brand who make, I'm trying to think of something non-horsey, let's say handbags, although, who doesn't love a lovely handbag? If you're working with a handbag brand, let's say, and you are a brand ambassador for that handbag brand, the chances are you will have a contract or some kind of agreement with the brand that will say, you're our brand ambassador, we're really excited to work with you, yada, yada, yada. We would not, we do, as a brand ambassador, we don't expect to see directly conflicting products appearing on your grid feed social medias, because if you're working with somebody as a brand ambassador, and if they're supplying you with products regularly, if they're paying you, which can 100% happen, then they don't expect you to also be promoting brands that conflict. And that's really worth keeping in mind, because that might be a reason why you don't want to be an ambassador, because you want to be able to have the ability to pick and choose different products. And it might be that as a brand ambassador, if you work with a brand that has a lot of different product types, you could find it very, very limiting with regard to who else you could work with if they have said, as a brand ambassador for us, we don't want you to be promoting all of these different products. And that's completely up to them to say, as much as it's completely up to you to say, okay, that's going to be tricky for me. And if that is the case, please do tell the brand before you get involved in a longer term agreement with them, because no one's going to do well if you enter it thinking, no, I like to work with lots of other people and I've been tied up in all these categories. You're going to resent it a bit. And also, you could maybe not do the best for the brand. So if that's the case, I would 100% speak to the brand and say, I would really love to work with you. However, this is quite limiting. But again, the other side of the coin is if it's limiting, but they're supplying you with everything you could possibly need in every category, then you perhaps don't need to work with any other brands. So there's lots of different elements to it. But I mean, with all of this, it's all about communicating anyway. If you're a brand ambassador, or if you're an influencer and you're working with a brand on a specific project, do communicate. Communication is key. So generally, you don't mix. If you're a brand ambassador, you stay loyal and true in all your content to those posts, to that brand, and all your posts that you do around that kind of product should really feature them. With an influencer, you can be a lot more flexible. And another thing as well is that sometimes if you are working with a brand and they, as I said, they had a lot of products, they would perhaps take exception or not be thrilled if you are promoting a product that's a conflict to their catalogue, essentially, even if that's not something that you work with them on. So that's important to be clear about. And also, if the brand adds different products to their range, does that mean that you're not able to work with other brands who have those products too? So it's not a bad thing at all, because the beauty of being a brand ambassador is that you have that closer connection with the brand, which can allow you to do an awful lot more with them. And to be fair, this could also work with an influencer if you were working with a brand just on a project basis as an influencer. But if you're a brand ambassador, you're likely to be more involved with the kind of conversations going on with the ongoing campaigns. You might even be able to have a say in different products or give feedback, because it's a longer term commitment to the brand, and it will allow you to get to know the brand, or it should allow you to get to know the brand better, because you've got that longer term interest. With a brand ambassador, it may be that it's a kind of ongoing arrangement, and then if people aren't happy, it then gets reviewed. Or it might be that it's for a year, and I do see quite a lot of brand ambassador competitions going. And they're usually for a limited amount of time. So that could be another aspect too. Brand ambassador competitions, I think, are quite interesting, because again, thinking about the work I do, and I'm sure that the brands running the competitions do this, is that there's a few different elements at play here, which I always think is really interesting. So I would never advise a brand to work with a brand ambassador that they never had an interest in before. They haven't seen the product, tried the product on, they haven't started to form that connection. And it can be that they've approached them a little while before and said, we'd really like to work with you. Could we send you some products and we can have a chat? Fine, absolutely fine. We all have to start any relationship we have somewhere. But for someone to apply to something and they've never had any affinity with a brand before, I think that's quite an interesting thing. And I think it's also quite interesting from the followers of that person as well, because if they've been talking a lot about a conflicting brand and have completely switched over, again, it's all interesting, isn't it? But I digress. So that's the general difference between a brand ambassador is usually connected to a number of brands, and an influencer is usually more of a free agent. With both of them, I would say, though, that be aware of, I want to say, collecting brands. And I'm hoping this is kind of dying off a bit now, but it's something that during 2020 I saw a lot of. And that was some accounts seem to want to be supported by, sponsored by, a brand ambassador for as many brands as they could possibly get their hands on. And I would really urge anyone to think hard about whether this is a good thing to do. Because with ever brand ambassadorship you take on, there is a kind of a commitment, I guess, that you're going to be working with that brand. And it's not a one-off thing. If you've got 10 of them and you want to work with them all on a long-term basis, they're going to expect something back in return for any work or effort they put in your direction. And if you've got 10 and you're thinking, okay, well, I'll post twice a month for each of them, well, that's 20 posts that you've got to do with their products, and ideally some stories and anything else that you can work on together. And that can be quite a big commitment. Now, if you're a professional rider and you've got 1 million horses to ride each day, are you also going to have time to do that many photo shoots, posts, whatever? This isn't to put you off, but it's just to maybe hopefully make you think a bit about the brands that you work with and the commitment of time, because it's really disappointing from a brand point of view as well. If they've given you product or they're paying to work with you and you're not delivering the goods because you're completely overwhelmed with everything else you're doing, all the other brands you're working with, you could lose brands, you could lose really nice connections. So just be really aware of how many you take on, and whether that's as a brand ambassador or as an influencer. Pace yourself. If you're doing it as a job and your job is an influencer and this is what you do and you have a photo shoot every week and you put those pictures on, and that's a different animal because it's your job. But for many people, being a brand ambassador or an influencer very much runs alongside their job. And if that's the case, just be aware, especially in the winter and the colder months when the daylight hours are tighter and everything looks a mess, it can get quite stressful. So that's something to be aware of. So the next thing is about whether brand ambassadors and influencers get paid. And the short answer is there's absolutely the scope for that. I know of a few brands who pay to work with their brand ambassadors because they want that extra exposure and they want to support them to help them thrive in whatever they're doing. And I also know of brands who pay for individual campaigns with influencers. And again, there's a really good reason why. Of course, this doesn't mean that everybody will be being paid or that every brand will be happy to pay. And there are usually different factors that go into deciding whether or not someone is going to pay a brand ambassador or an influencer. Often it can be the size of the following. So larger accounts are more likely to charge to have that kind of connection. With a brand ambassadorship, it may be that the product outweighs that, or it might be that they get money towards a specific thing that the influencer does. It depends on the product. It depends on the money the money involved, on what kind of content the influencer or brand ambassador is looking to provide. If the influencer is saying, "I'm going to have a photo shoot every month, and you're going to get 50 images that you can use," that's really valuable for a brand because they don't have to pay for a photo shoot then. They can use those images. So it's probably worth paying the ambassador, or potentially, because they're getting something kind of tangible as a result, or whether that influencer is going to post however many times or whatever they're doing. And again, with an influencer, you may say, okay, well, this is the product I want to launch. I'd like you to try it. I'd like to test it. It would be great to do a live together. It would be great if you would do a blog. It would be great if you would do an IGTV. It would be great to share in stories. All of those things. And that's going to allow the influencer to price that, because not only are you getting exposure to their audience, but the amount of work they're going to have to do to carry out what you want them to do, it could be really quite significant. So in terms of payment, it's absolutely possible whether you're a brand ambassador or you're an influencer, but you will need to have, you're going to need to have a decent following. You're going to need to post regularly. You're going to need to produce tangible things. And I think the best thing to do, whether you're working on a campaign basis or you're working with a brand on an ongoing basis, is to have a frank chat and say, right, what are you expecting me to produce? Or you say, I can produce this for you each month. Does this work with you? Because you then know what you need to deliver, and they then know what to expect. And that will help to manage any queries, questions, disappointments, just because it's all out there. So both can be paid. So the difference really is in the kind of loyalty aspect as I see it. In terms of the labelling, and I did an article on Horse and Hound a little while about this, about ad, gifted, ad, PR, product, etc., etc. Both need labelling. Whether you're a brand ambassador and have an ongoing connection, or you are an influencer who has been paid for or gifted products to talk about, you need to make sure that your audience know that how that product was got, i.e. you didn't pay for it. If you Google Horse and Hound gifted, it should come up. It's an article that I wrote. It took a long time to write. I worked with the ASA and the CMA to check that information, but definitely have a look, because it is so important that we label our content correctly for lots of different reasons. And whether you're a brand ambassador or an influencer, you should be labeling your content correctly. It is important that people know when they're being sold to, really. So do check that out. And whether you're a brand ambassador or an influencer, you need to be aware of that. Think always about the care for your audience as well with both of them. I think we've covered that before. In terms of making sure they don't feel like they're just being used, like they're a pawn in the game, make sure that's important. And another thing, whether you're a brand ambassador or an influencer, if you are looking to approach brands, you still should be approaching them nicely, kindly, and with thought. So for both, if you're approaching a brand, it's really good to show that you've got that affinity with the brand, that you are engaging with them, that you're liking their posts, that you're commenting, that you're sharing posts if you love the things. If you have got their products, that you're putting them on your stories and chatting about them. That's a really good flashing beacon to a brand that you're of interest because you genuinely like the product. Again, treat them with respect. They're busy people. If you're trying to pitch to a brand, and I know I did a podcast about this a little while ago about how not to approach a brand, is sending a DM. I don't massively object to that, especially if it's that you've got that conversation going and it makes sense, or better still saying, I would really like to speak to somebody about the possibility of what's the best email address, for example. But you don't send a generic message. You just don't send a dear sir, I would probably get. And you don't ask for things to start with. I just think it's so rude. I think you talk about whether there's the opportunity to work together or whether they have any vacancies, but rather than, if you send me this, and this, I'll do this. And you look and they sometimes don't even follow the brand. It's really quite bizarre. And often it's the first contact. That's not going to work. Whether you want to be a brand ambassador or you want to work with them as an influencer, that is not appropriate. And then you don't send a line of question marks after a moment either. But that's another podcast I feel we need to revisit. So whether you approach the brand, whether you want to do it as a brand ambassador or of a one-off campaign, have a plan. How is your audience going to respond to their brand? What can you do to help promote them? And as I said, whether this is a one-off or a long-term thing, or whether it starts as a one-off and becomes a long-term thing, there's loads of scope there. It's really exciting. But regardless, you need to approach them with respect and with care. So there we go. Difference between a brand ambassador and an influencer, according to me, but according to what from the research I've done, from how I see them and how everybody I work with, I'm trying to think if there's any exceptions to the rule, sees them. And as I said, there is a crossover. Influencers, brand ambassadors are influencers, and many influencers do have brand ambassadorships as well. But there are those important differences there. But there are also an awful lot of similarities in terms of the labels, in terms of possible payment, in terms of clarity around the work you're doing. I hope you've enjoyed that. I hope you found it useful. As always, if you listened, please do screenshot and share to stories. I love to see who's listening. And if you are interested in finding more about how to be a brand ambassador or an influencer, particularly in the kind of equestrian and riding space, I've got a really good digital course called Social Supercharge Riders, which is a digital course you can do at your own pace, your own time, that talks through how riders can improve their social media to help it attract whatever they want. In addition to the course, there's also a free Facebook group where anything that I do in terms of working with the NFU Countryside, with the equestrian panel, the review panel, works through that group. And there are also some amazing discounts in the group for some incredible brands that have got on board. You can find all of that over at riafreemanpr.co.uk, and if you go to the Work With Me drop down, it's in there. Thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you found that episode useful, and we'll catch up really, really soon. Take care.